Good morning, everybody. My name is Tassos Haniotis, and this is today's podcast of the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. I'm a special advisor at the Forum on issues that relate to sustainable productivity, but today, for the first time, I'm in a different role. I will not be asked questions, but I will be asking questions. In fact, I'm hosting a guest that has come for the annual conference of the Forum, all the way from the other side of the Atlantic. It is Jessica Agnew, and I will ask her to introduce herself and tell her why is she here and what she's going to present both today and at the conference of the forum. So Jess, could you tell us please where you're coming from, what you are, and what you have done?
Absolutely.
Recently.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, my first time to Brussels. So I'm Jessica Agnew, and I'm the director of the Global Agricultural Productivity Initiative at Virginia Tech. And I'm also the managing editor of the GAP report, which is the heart of the GAP initiative. So this is a project that was started in 2010 by a different association called the Global Harvest Initiative. It was a collection of a number of agribusinesses that were really interested in how sustainable productivity growth could be used as a strategy in the agriculture sector to meet competing end uses or competing demands for the end uses of agricultural products. This report gained a global following and influences policy, investment, operational decisions for businesses. And the report came to Virginia Tech in 2019, where the companies felt that it would fit very well at a university where we can kind of put forward objective analysis, but more through a storytelling lens. So, many reports, as you know, and are very academic coming out of universities, but we wanted something a little bit more accessible for different types of audiences and also to help build bridges. So how can productivity growth be the table that we can all meet at and talk about different ideologies in the agriculture and food system? So if you're not an economist and you don't get really nerdy about estimates of productivity like maybe you and I do, productivity, I think, for the general audience is really interesting because it tells us something about the innovation going on in the system. It's everything we're getting everything more we're getting out of our inputs in terms of how output use is growing. So it tells us something about improved fertilizers, improved genetics, precision agriculture. And if productivity growth is slowing, that tells us something about the innovation within our system. So that's where I got really interested in the GAP initiative and have been working on this now for the past 3 years.
And in this GAP initiative and the report, what are the basic key findings? Also, if you could add, where could people find this report? Because I looked at your website,
Yep.
There's plenty of information.
Absolutely. So the report comes out every year in October. So this year will be launched October 2nd. So make sure to save the date in your calendar. So each year we report on a data set that was formerly produced by U.S. Department of Agriculture and now is produced by an individual economist that we use called the International Agricultural Productivity Data Set. And so this allows for comparisons between countries. And so we produced this report in October after the kind of the global data sets that are published over the summer. So from last year's report, and actually for the past few years, what we see is that total factor productivity, so this measures productivity across land, labor, capital, and other types of materials, is slowing. So productivity is this ratio between inputs and outputs. So we want productivity to be growing. It is effectively land sparing. It helps to preserve biodiversity. It helps reduce the environmental footprint of agriculture. And we want to see that innovation is driving productivity growth. Unfortunately, what we see is that it has been cooling for the last decade or so. We were doing pretty well in the early 2000s at about 2% total factor productivity growth per year. And for the past several years, we've been seeing less than 1%. So the average annual total factor productivity growth we reported last year is 0.7%. In order to sustainably meet the demands of on our agricultural system, so it's not just food, but fiber, fuels, feed, we need to be averaging 2% annually. So we have to make up this gap in some way.
But this gap, well, there are two ways of explaining it. First of all, in focusing more about the individual factors that explained, because you mentioned something that happens at the global level. Mm-hmm. So let's first discuss this, and then we'll go and see what are the differences that we see at the regional level. But at the global level, you mentioned about the input use, you mentioned about land and labor, these factors. Which are the ones that are explain more this slowdown of what we have had in productivity growth?
There are two ways that you can drive productivity growth that I'll start with. So first, there are technologies, tools, management practices that already exist, may have even existed for some decades now, that farmers still aren't adopting. And that could be because of financing, it could be because of extension systems that where the knowledge just isn't reaching the farmer. And so we really want to try to drive adoption of those tools. So in 2023, our report title was Every Farmer, Every Tool. So we really advocate that every farmer should be able to access every proven and appropriate tool. So we're talking about productivity at all scales of production. This isn't just for big farmers. Small scale farmers can be productive too and drive that global average. So we want to be able to see that every farmer can access those tools. So there are different policies that may prevent farmers from accessing tools. There may be subsidies that distort the use of certain tools, like fertilizer subsidies in some regions of the world. So the first piece is the adoption. And then the second piece is making sure that we have enough investment in agricultural R&D that we're able to continue to push the frontier with the total amount of productivity that's possible. And that's becoming increasingly complicated in an era of changing climates, extreme weather events, and other types of shocks. We've seen, even in the last few weeks, shocks to our agricultural system because of geopolitical events, economic shocks, amongst others. So those would be the two kind of main driving categories towards this slowdown in productivity growth. There sort of reached saturation, or we've kind of maxed out the amount of adoption of some of our earlier productivity enhancing tools like improved genetics. And then we're just seeing this real slowdown in some areas of the world that have been historically frontier leaders in productivity growth. And so that's pulling the global average down.
But if we look more into a regional detail, what does it tell us in terms of the various regions? I guess you reflect more in terms of continents, which is an aggregation, but at least it gives us a sense of what are the differences that we observe in different parts of the world.
Yeah, so South Asia is a really great example of both pushing the frontier limits and driving adoption. So India specifically, as well as China, have been, so I guess technically Southeast Asia, but they have been really driving huge investments in agricultural R&D, both publicly and also attracting private sector investment as well. And then India has also really been prioritizing the information and communication technology adoption, particularly among smallholder farmers. So trying to strengthen their extension system and making sure that smallholder farmers are accessing these latest technologies and innovation. So if in case the graph isn't published right now, South Asia is averaging a 1.48% total factor productivity growth, while Northeast Asia, including China, is at about 1.9%. So these are the current productivity frontier leaders globally right now. North America, unfortunately, has really kind of zeroed out its productivity growth in the past decade. In the kind of globally comparable data set, they're actually below zero, I think about negative 2.3% between 2014 and 2023. Sub-Saharan Africa continues to struggle. They average about 0.3% total factor productivity growth annually. And so that is a region that really exemplifies the need to make sure that farmers have access to these tools. And tools can be policies, but also management practices. It doesn't necessarily mean like the most advanced, precision agriculture technologies, even just some of the most basics like improved genetics and seed varieties.
But if we look at these regions, For example, you mentioned before China and India, which because of their size dominators of what we see in Asia. They're constrained in terms of land, so it's research, development, new applications that explains productivity growth. When we focus more on Africa and Latin America, is there land that is still available to explain this growth in productivity, or is all driven? I mean, Brazil, I guess, will dominate Latin America. There are a lot of world research and development actually has pushed productivity growth.
So, interestingly, in Latin America, there hasn't been a lot of land extensification, so moving into new lands for agricultural production. We do see land conversion, so converting pasture lands to croplands in Latin America. So they have some modest total factor productivity growth, but most of their output growth is still coming from input intensification. In Africa, of course, their output growth is mostly currently being driven by land extensification. So when it comes to environmental sustainability, this is not the story we want to see. It's not inherently unsustainable to have a growth in input use or a growth in land, but when you consider converting land, especially some of the lands they have in Africa that can be rich in biodiversity, into agricultural production, that's when you can start to see environmental degradation. So we really would love to see Africa coming up on their total factor productivity, not expanding their lands, but in increasing what they can grow on the land they currently have in production.
Now, there's always a difference between what we wish and
Yeah.
what comes out. So, but if we want to turn our wishes into reality, this path forward, what are the basic characteristics that we should see in terms of helping productivity regain some of the previous paths, especially this gap that you mentioned between the 2% desired annual rate of growth and the 0.7% actual rate of growth?
So this last year in the report, we looked at different technological domains that emerge as an agriculture sector develops. So when you're first, they had the Europeans immigrating to North America. Of course, new lands are brought into production. And then technological innovation kind of starts to happen to make that land expansion a little bit more productive. So you've got mechanization, you're moving past the hand tilling and into machinery that's helping to drive that productivity growth. Eventually you see that kind of plateau. And as that productivity from those first tools starts to drop off, then you start to see the input intensification domain emerge. So you're going to start using more fertilizers, more seeds, and in livestock, more pasture, more feed. But there are significant improvements made in all of those inputs that allow you to get more than a 1-to-1 ratio. And then eventually those productivity growth returns start to drop off. And then a new domain emerged, which is efficiency optimization. So these are precision agriculture technologies, advanced genomic techniques, improved management practices, really trying to harness the efficiency optimization. And then again, you're going to see the productivity growth, your returns drop off. So what we've been seeing I would say in the past 5 or 6 years is a new domain emerging, which we called systems integration. So this is really recognizing that agriculture systems sit in environmental systems, social systems, economic systems. And the tools that are emerging now are really trying to consider how to achieve total factor productivity growth in light of these interactions. So Europe is actually a really great example of, first of all, stable TFP growth. They've really kind of kept it around 1%, if not more, over several decades, and really thinking about these efficiency optimization and systems integration tools. So as climates are changing and we have more pressures from pests and diseases, it's positioned the EU as a leader in this space with more advanced kind of tools to allow farmers to respond to their conditions that they're facing. So what we really would advocate for is 2 things. Again, driving adoption of existing tools. So we see that, especially in the US, we did a deep dive on the US this year in the GAP report, there is almost near saturation of some of those earlier domain tools. But the adoption of later stage tools like variable rate technologies is still pretty low. I think it's maybe 30 or 40% in the US still. And so I think there are a number of ways that you can think about reinvigorating that adoption. And then we also need to be pushing those frontiers out. So we can even revisit some of the earlier domains. So I mentioned, the case of Latin America and these converting the land use from pasture to crops. So that can go all the way back to the extensification domain. How do you change the way that agriculture or that lands are farmed, all the way through to systems integration? So there's lots of different ones, but those would be the main two that we're looking at.
Maybe let me focus now on one of the graph and one comparison that drew my attention immediately, which is a comparison between North America and Europe.
Yep.
In a sense, it's natural that the growth rate of total factor productivity in these two regions is lower than the rest of the world, because we're talking about annual rates of growth, but the absolute numbers are very different. They started much earlier. First of all, these are regional averages that hide some differences. North America is Canada, is US, and is Mexico. In Europe is the European Union, and is Ukraine and Russia. So one thing is what differentiates there. The other element that I found very interesting is that in Europe, most of the growth is happening with an input extensification. In North America, it's actually happening with input intensification. So it's same total factor productivity growth, but with a completely different model. I mean, what does this tell us in terms of the factors that affected it, but also in terms of do we know enough about the policies that actually have had an impact in making these differences?
Yeah, the policy environment is so interesting, and I think you can clearly see it in the North America example. So, first of all, Mexico has had very strong total factor productivity growth. I think they're averaging 2% annually in the last decade. Canada, from 2011 to 2020, averaged 1.8% productivity growth. From 2014 to 2023, that's come down to almost zero. And so, I think the kind of natural reaction when people see that TFP growth in North America is, slightly negative, depending on the data set that you're looking at. But in any case, near around zero, they think, okay, well, the US has been growing productivity forever. It's already high. So, of course, it's zero. But Canada has a very similar agriculture production environment to the US. And even up until the last complete decade we have data for, they're at 1.8% when the US still in that same period was about zero. So I think this tells us a lot about policies, and it tells us also something about the returns from public agriculture R&D. So the US started to decrease their investment in public ag R&D back in the 80s. And so there's about a 20 to 30 year time lag. So it's not just me, all the preeminent US experts in productivity growth will tell you that this is one of the main drivers. And then the other challenge that we kind of illuminated in this last year's report is what is being invested in research and development wise. The National Institute for Food and Agriculture, NIFA, in the US is one of the main sources of funding. And there was more than 100% increase in funding on economics, which, you and I would like, but a significant decrease, I think more than 30 or 40% in key topics that would drive productivity growth. So for more details, you can check out the GAP report, which I didn't answer your question earlier, is at globalagriculturalproductivity.org. And looking more at the distribution of funding between different, on topics that would drive productivity growth. But then in Canada, you see this huge drop off, and this is primarily because of the policy environment. So in between 2015 and 2020, there was an implementation to reduce emissions by 30% from agriculture. And it was very mandate driven, as opposed to allowing farmers to determine for themselves how could they achieve this goal. And this policy was implemented before farmers really had the tools to maintain productivity and profitability. And so that last systems integration piece and really thinking about the tools we have available for our farmers is absolutely critical. So then you come to the EU, and TFP growth is strong at about 1%, but in the EU specifically, there's negative output growth. So there's different ideologies. America views themselves as the breadbasket of the world, that they should be, providing the volume of caloric density globally, whereas EU takes a very different kind of stance on output growth. So it is very interesting to see the balance of policies and then ideologies about the global role in agriculture and how it affects TFP.
I mean, these are pretty interesting findings, which have to be revisited in view of what we're about to face. Because
Yes, definitely.
especially in the European Union, but also globally, we're facing a squeeze in the cost of production, farming, energy, and especially fertilizer costs indicate that. We see also a very significant increase in the level of food prices without necessarily farmers getting the advantage of it. So we're entering a period where we would have to go back to the basics and re-examine what you have. But if I am to summarize our very interesting discussion that we had so far, what is coming out is, first of all, we don't have a global model, but different characteristics.
Yeah.
Research and development played a very significant role in giving a boost to total factor productivity growth in the past, less than what land has done. So the focus has to be on how we find a more optimal way of using inputs by achieving an increase of output without increasing the quantity of input used. In fact, the desirable way would to reduce it. And what type of policies we need in the future, what impact current policy had, I think the report has indications, but it also shows that we need to focus much more in the future. And I hope we'll have another opportunity with more information to do that in the future. In the meantime, I would like to thank you very much for what you presented to us. I would like to invite all of you to check the website and the updates of it. October the 2nd. October the 2nd should be on your calendar. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and wish you all the best for what you're doing today or the rest of the period. Goodbye.